today really celebrates this level of commitment to our profession and to moments like this of sharing, of dialogue, of collaboration, of future projects together. So I'm really honored to open queste giornate di studio with a paper which on documentaries in the Mediterranean. I would like to mention before I read my paper that this panel has only 3 speakers. Unfortunately, our first one of our speakers from the United States, from the University of Chicago, is unable to join us for health reasons, but after me, there will be Iacovella, and the third speaker will be our colleague Guenther. This gives us more time for our papers, but we'll try not to read too long papers so that there is more room and more time for an exchange of views and for a debate. So I will signal to the speakers the 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and 1 minute before the end of the paper, but you, could you please do it for me? All right, so the title of my paper is Il mare della nostra storia, the sea of our history, 100 years of Italian history in Libya. And this is a documentary by Giovanna Gagliardo. Filmmaker Giovanna Gagliardo started her career as a journalist for Il Giorno, Il Messaggero, Repubblica, L'Espresso, and at the same time she worked as a screenplay writer for Rai television series, specifically on programs that dealt with news. This is important because we will see how her journalistic training and experience will be reflected in her more recent work. In cinema, she started as a screenwriter for Alberto Lattuada and the Hungarian filmmaker Miklos Jankso, who also was her husband. Her debut film was Maternale, Mother and Daughter, 1978, a psychological and symbolic representation of the relationship between mother and daughter. After directing several feature films throughout the 80s and the 90s, she developed an interest in historical documentaries. And in 2004, she produced Bellissime Part 1. In 2006, Bellissime Part 2. This diptych is a collection of archival footage about the history of women from the beginning of, until the 1960s, until today, until the 90s in the 20th century. Following Bellissime in 2009, Gagliardo produced The Dress for the Future, a documentary about the sociocultural and economic history of Italy through fashion. A particularly poignant documentary is Victims, the Lead Years, commemorating 40 years of domestic terrorism, starting with the bombing of Piazza Fontana in Milan in December 1969 and ending with the commemoration of the 40th anniversary in 2009, which revisits the Lead Years through the stories of the survivors and the victims' families. In 2012, Gagliardo directed 20 Years, a docu-fiction which starts on the night of November the 9th, 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and ends on September the 15th, 2008, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. So it's very recurrent, this sense of retelling history and remembering anniversaries, 20, 50, 60 years, 90 years. In her 2016, the director produced a documentary, The Roman Women, Stories of Women and Neighborhoods. In all her documentaries, Gagliardo recomposes historical periods in their multiple cultural aspects. Her films are journeys across history with a multifaceted filmic text. She employs visual sources and weaves into the fabric of the historical transformations the many voices that contributed specifically to the 20th century. Presented at the Festival of Cinema in Rome on October 19th, 2018, the documentary Il mare della nostra storia, in Istituto Luce e Cinecittà production, Gagliardo's most recent film follows the style and patterns of her previous works. She explains, quote, "I wanted that protagonists could speak without a voiceover that would interpret the events," end of quote. She carefully interweaves private spheres and public tragedies, revisits political realities, and re-examines prominent figures, thus producing a montage of historical sources and human stories. This and all her documentaries can be considered volumes of testimonies which contributed to fill cinematographic voids of historical themes and events. Organized around the 17 major chapters, each subdivided into several topics with a complex diachronic editing, Il mare della nostra storia follows a fluid and linear chronological progression centered on specific historical periods, while it develops around a cyclical, spiraling sequencing of selected segments of interviews. In this film, Gagliardo narrates the history of Italian colonialism in Libya, more precisely from the perspective of the Italian community in Tripoli, starting from the Italian occupation of the capital city on October the 5th, 1911, and continuing up until the capture and killing of Muammar al-Gaddafi in Sirte on October the 20th, 2011. Exactly 100 years of political, cultural, and economic relationships between the two countries. Under the Ottoman Empire, since the mid-16th century, Libya was divided into three regions: Tripolitania, Fezzan, and Cyrenaica. The Ottoman rule continued until the Italo-Turkish War in 1911-1912, which resulted in the Italian occupation of the country and the establishment of two colonies, Italian Tripolitania and Italian Cyrenaica, from 1911 to 1934, later unified in the Italian-Libyan colony from 1934 to 1947. The name Libya derives from the Greek goddess Libya, Poseidon's wife, and it was used by the Greeks for all North Africa, except Egypt. Libya also derives from the Egyptian term Libu, which refers to one of the Berber tribes living in the desert. In 1934, Italy chose Libya as the official name of the unified colony, with Tripoli as its capital city. So the Italian presence in the country stretched nearly 6 decades, starting in 1911 and reaching its climax under the government of Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti and during Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. A primary goal of the Italian colonization was to use Libya to alleviate overpopulation and unemployment in Italy. Thus, the Italian settlement was a major element of the colonial policy, and several projects were launched. Mussolini called Libya the fourth shore and planned to turn it into an Italian colony politically, militarily, economically, and ethnically. As a result, in the 19-teens, 20,000, and in the 30s, more than 100,000 Italians from deprived and overpopulated rural provinces, predominantly from southern Italy and the Veneto and Reggio Emilia regions, moved to Tripolitania and Cyrenaica in order to settle and irrigate those dry coastal areas. However, after the end of the Second World War, and as a consequence of significant and dramatic changes in the European geopolitical scenario, the Italian rule in Libya suddenly came to an end, and dozens of thousands of settlers were forced to repatriate. Most of the Italian middle class remained in Tripoli as permanent foreign residents. That was their official status as agreed with the United Nations Deliberation 1951 under the rule of King Idris. However, in 1969, all Italians residing in Libya were forced to leave the country following the coup d'etat led by 27-year-old Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi, who overthrew the Libyan political and religious leader Idris, who had ruled as king of the United Kingdom of Libya from 1951 to 1969. The history of Italian colonialism in Libya has been underrepresented in film productions and relatively understudied. Although Rosario is a scholar in the field, and I really enjoyed our conversation this morning, I'm sure you have a lot to add to my paper, which is more a film analysis than a historical analysis. The 30 years of following the end of the Second World War were characterized by the troubling absence of scholarly studies on this topic and era. The lack of attention towards this chapter of Italian history has to be contextualized within the national sense of shame and guilt caused by the systematic violence, arbitrary killings, and deportations that marked the Italian occupation of the country under the fascist rule. The knowledge of these events contradicted the popular, self-praising, and reassuring narratives built around the myth of colonization and development of Libya, thus leading to the collective suppression of these dishonorable memories. Therefore, Il mare della nostra storia attempts to fill a gap in Italian history and film production. Stylistically, the film is characterized by the absence of a voiceover and strongly relies on the power of images and the intertwining of diverse sources, such as original footage and photographs retrieved from several Italian audiovisual archives, from private home movies made available to the director, from direct interviews with a number of prominent figures from the Italian community in Tripoli. The film's soundtrack is mostly characterized by songs that celebrate the Italian endeavors in Libya, describing Tripoli as a promised land, such as the 1977 nostalgic song Ma Mediterranee by Herbert Pagani and Paolo Conte's 1968 song Tripoli 69, performed by Patti Bravo. These, among other songs, play a fundamental role in marking the film's narrative milestones and transitions. Thematically, a significant part of this documentary revolves around the depiction of Libya and its capital as places of memory. In the numerous first-hand accounts of the Libyan Italian community that include well-known socialites like Maria Cicogna and members of the Italian Jewish community such as Iris Raccafelus and music agent David Sard, Tripoli is remembered as a luminous Mediterranean city, almost a mythical place, a sunny seaside location with long beaches and a milder climate all year long, a multicultural hub with a strong Italian character and very little Arab influence. Such polyphonic narrative describes a belle epoque of a wealthy and sophisticated urban bourgeoisie made of socialites, businessmen, successful professionals, engineers, and diplomats. Among all accounts, particularly significant is the one by Anna Maria Cancellieri, the former Italian Minister of the Interior, who narrates the history of her father, an engineer who moved to Libya to design and build the extensive irrigation system for the recently occupied lands of Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. Cancellieri's words stand out since she openly recognizes the violence intrinsic in the colonization process, contextualizing and understanding the resentment of the local populations towards the Italian colonizers. At the same time, however, she highlights the importance of the infrastructures as well as the social, economic, and technological improvements that were promoted and put in place under the Italian rule. Similarly, historian Luigi Goglia from Roma Tre University attempts to draw a complex and nuanced portrait of Italian colonialism in Libya from an academic point of view. one that is able to see far beyond the nostalgic or celebratory accounts of the Italian bourgeoisie. Golia points out how the harsh resentment of the Arab community in the age of Gaddafi originated much earlier from the schemes put in place in 1930 by the fascist regime in order to deport Cyrenaica's local population that had been supporting charismatic Arab leader Omar Mukhtar's riots against the colonial army. This operation that affected around 100,000 Libyan civilians was characterized by arbitrary executions, including the one that killed Mukhtar. For 20 years, since 1911, Mukhtar led the Libyan resistance against the Italian occupiers, who suffered heavy losses as a result of his hit-and-run tactics. On September the 16th, 1931, the 73-year-old resistance leader was hanged by the fascist Italian occupation authorities after refusing to accept their terms of surrender. His remarkable life, at least in its final phase, was depicted in the 1981 historical epic war feature film, Lion of the Desert, by Syrian-American producer and director Mustafa Akkad, and funded by the government under Muammar Gaddafi. Images from the film are included in Gagliardo's documentary. The film was censored in Italy, where the distribution was forbidden because it was considered damaging of the honor of the Italian army. It was aired on television only once on Sky in 2009 and never aired by Italian public television. The last part of Il mare della nostra storia mostly deals with the quick downfall of the Italian Jewish community in Tripoli, dramatically accelerated by the rise of Arab nationalism in Libya following the 1967 Arab-Israeli Six-Day War in Gaddafi's rise to power in 1969. The accounts of the sudden and forced repatriation of the Italians constituted a fundamental section of the documentary, one that effectively captures the trauma of a population that abruptly transitioned from being rooted and with a strong sense of belonging to being stranded and stateless in Italy. Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi's attempts to reconcile the Italian and Libyan governments in the early 2000s, as well as his ambiguous friendship with Gaddafi, are depicted as farcical. However, as Gagliardo's conclusion shows, the long-awaited opportunity to reestablish the shared memory and to reconcile the peoples from different sides of the Mediterranean Sea arose from the recent visits of the Liby. Liby are those who were born in Libya, and whether they're Italian, whether they're Libyan, the debate is open, but they call themselves the Liby, members of the Italian Libyan community to Tripoli, who were finally allowed after over 40 years to return to the land of their youth. The last chapter of the film introduces the work of photographer Hiba Shalabi, who in 2018 conducted a special photo reportage to save the memory of Tripoli and restore its Italian artistic and architectural heritage. Il mare della nostra storia is a carefully crafted documentary based on a very detailed archival research, which effectively combines a variety of audiovisual materials held in different archives with the undeniable strength of the oral evidence provided by first-hand accounts. However, some critics argue that Gagliardo's deliberate choice to give a voice to privileged and wealthy members of the Italian community in Libya and to narrate this chapter of Italian colonial history from their point of view affects its historical accuracy. Anna Maria Cancellieri and Luigi Goglia's reflections on the evils of Italian colonialism in Libya are confined to a few minutes in a 95-minute-long film, which is probably not enough to provide the viewers with an all-encompassing picture and a balanced portrait of this controversial chapter of Italian and Libyan history. Il mare della nostra storia, like in her previous documentaries, Gagliardo works with a mixture of arts and media in order to produce an intermediate representation of history. She implements the use of archival film footage, newsreels, private films, songs, photographs, interviews, cinema, television, architecture, paintings, monuments, land, and seascapes as a historiographic and cinematic method. Intermediality refers to the interbreeding of artistic and technical media forms, and Gagliardo's hybridity of sources is particularly notable. The focus of her filmmaking combines extra filmic texts, resulting in an original aesthetic blend, thus breaking the boundaries between narrative forms and constituting a balanced space for artistic expressions. Intermediality allows Gagliardo to place a variety of styles and genres on an equal footing, resulting in a kaleidoscope that documents and reflects Italian historical and political complexity. In conclusion, Gagliardo employs a strategy of realness that turns her film into an actual document with a specific educational purpose that is not just recording all news, but offering opportunities for reflection on the intricacies of historical events. She also interweaves private spheres and public events, analyzes political realities, and re-examines intellectual figures while producing a montage of historical sources and provocative testimonies. This is an example of how the art of documentary filmmaking can ultimately give the realities it represents the rich qualities that il mare della nostra storia possesses. As I often have written on previous articles on Gagliardo's work, Gagliardo's extraordinary research and masterful cinematographic editing can be considered a theoretical manifesto for the creative reuse of archival footage for a counter history of Italy. Thank you very much. There is a 1 minute and 30 seconds trailer. Thank you.
Da Libia dove io ero una ragazza era un paese fantastico. Anche di felicità.
Sono curioso di essere la prima.
The word in my presentation is related to my own words of docu-realities. I combine together documentaries and realities because I think that this is also where we're going with documentaries. We're creating realities together. We're combining fiction with documentaries, as was mentioned by Director Taviani here, that Gomorrah, for example, is a very close example to this type of fusion between the reality, the documentary, harsh documentary, with the fictional elements, of course. Umberto Eco, in his Migrazione, the first slide, please, Intolleranza, a collection of his writing and public lectures. He states, and this is in Italian there, and I'm going to quote him in English. Immigration is different from migration in that the first is contained in number. One example is the immigration of Italians to the United States, and the second shapes more radically the culture of a country in which migrants arrive. Umberto Eco goes on comparing the Roman patricians to the contemporary prejudiced citizens all over the world. In fact, even though the patricians opposed granting cives Romani to Gauls, Sarmatians, and Jews, the society nevertheless became multi-ethnic and for 500 years, consequently. The latest ISTAT findings from January 2020 revealed that there are over 5 million foreign residents in Italy, or 8.7%, which seems quite a bit for the population. And the major countries of origin are represented by Romania, Albania, Morocco, China, Ukraine, Philippines, India, Bangladesh, Egypt, and Pakistan. The migration setting is therefore homogeneous and in constant development. Several generations of immigrants alternate in time and place across Italy's territory as we speak, and the fluid migratory scenario, including recent large-scale migration from African countries, results in a complex demographic transformation, which requires, obviously, appropriate integration policies. Integration is not a linear process that starts from point A and arrives at point B, nor it is a process that may completely resolve itself. Because societies are ever changing, the process of blending into a new social environment, it is a difficult, tortuous passage for a wide number of migrating individuals, especially coming from diverse backgrounds. To understand the integration journey undertaken by immigrants in a new society is also, it is very arduous task. During the last decades, Italy has been highly impacted by migration. In recent years, the perception of immigrants has also been changed by anti-immigrant policies, unfortunately. Bisina and Zanella claim, quote, "These tensions seem motivated in large part by the reception that immigration imposes cultural externalities of the native population that immigrants integrate slowly, if at all. In fact, sizable adverse labor market and welfare effects are far from well documented," end quote. A recent study of immigrant minorities integration in Italy by Bisina and Tura in 2019 reported that higher rates of marriage between immigrants and the native population encourage a higher acceptance of minority cultures, which in turn allows immigrants to better maintain their distinctive cultural traits, which is Parasitism. And 75% of the immigration adopt the Italian language by second generation, which is also positive data, but with some differences from an ethnic group to another. While studies such as this may contribute to assess the immigrants' integration, one must still consider the obstructive policies in the country and the social environment to which the immigrants are coming to. During the last few years, there has also been a proliferation of films on immigration and integration. Initially, the difficulties with these films have been that they fail to trace the lives of migrants in the native countries before arriving to Italy. And the adaptation of the factual stories are not at all the same at the same level of experiences from one person to the other. A contributing factor to this is likely a cultural subordination from the dominant Italian point of view. As a result, immigration films lacked attention in film studies and cultural studies fields, especially in Italy. Nonetheless, some criticism has emerged from contemporary writers such as Giancarla Vanoli, who by her international experience in Italian studies discusses cinema and imaginary, and in her Nella Terra di Mezzo, Cinema e Migrazione in Italia, from 2018. Based on the philosopher Moran's theories in media studies, Vanoli underlines the influences between reality and imagination and creating a hybrid model between realism and imaginary. Ultimately, cinematic productions started functioning as a mirror, which Italian spectators are in front of and have a reflection by viewing both positive but also negative aspects of the social environment in which the migrants disembark. From anthropological reflection, there is the fact that Italy went from being a country of immigrants into becoming a country of immigrants. And the mass media adapted to present these changes more explicitly. A new generation of Italian filmmakers have emerged during the last 20 years of societal and political transformation. The intensification of migration phenomena in Italy has inspired several film directors to investigate connections among locals and migrants about the complexity of Italians' experience from a critical point of view. The new production have focused on experimenting with representation of the immigrants interacting with the local population. In this context, we find documentaries based on the original life stories with immigrants as subjects themselves. Io sono qui, 2017, by Sicilian director Gabriele Gavagna, represents one such form. The film has screened the national and international film festivals and received the award for Best Documentary Short at Los Angeles Film Awards in 2018. The documentary depicts the story of 3 migrants, Omar, Diney, and Maga, who arrived in Sicily as unaccompanied migrant minors after the difficult passage through the Saharan Desert and across the Mediterranean Sea. The 3 young men recount their experiences from the point of their arrival at the reception centers in Palermo, which facilitated their integration in Italy. More recently, Megan Carden, assistant professor of school anthropology at the University of Arizona, wrote in a 2019 article, Io sono qui, a film that appends narratives crisis through the voices of migrant youth. In this article, she describes how forms of media, such as documentaries, can highlight significant aspects of migrants' experiences in contrast to the details of residents' anxieties and uncertainties for the reception system. In the context of uncertainty and hostility toward the migrant population, representation of the issues have also developed in varied hybrid models. Some cinematic productions have embedded elements of fiction into actual stories, resulting in full-length films representing topics from a different artistic perspective. Some of these docu-fictions, as I say, or docu-realities, as my own words, show complex authenticities into a dramaturgic structure. Particularly, there have been films released in the last few years which represented complexity integration in Naples, one of the largest cities in the south of Italy, which counts more than 1 million inhabitants. Within the specific geographical and social context, there are 2 films that are taken in consideration in my paper today. Rosa Pietra Stella, 2020, by Marcello Sannino, and Vieni a vivere a Napoli, 2017, by 3 documentary filmmakers, De Angelis, Prisco, Lombardi. These films represent the plight from difficulties of immigrants integrating alongside the difficulties encountered by the natives themselves, Italians, sometimes resulting in their lives becoming intertwined. This proves difficult given Naples as both chaotic and multi-ethnic environment. Vieni a vivere a Napoli was produced by Alessandra and Andrea Cannavale in collaboration with the Rai Cinema and carries the label as an unusual comedy. The film has been recognized as a cultural interest with economic contribution on history of heritage in 2017. The dreamlike stories create a comic atmosphere. However, the film is also representing the cohabitation among immigrants from different backgrounds, such as Chinese, Ukrainian, and Sinhalese, with the local Neapolitans and their idiosyncrasies, especially with those. The film is publicized as comedy, while the story is a serious subject. But the filmmakers have revealed some uncomfortable truths about Italian society because the immigrants are stereotyped as the Neapolitans themselves. Ultimately, the resolution is that the stereotypes persist on both sides. The traditional stereotypes meet the reality of contemporary and social interactions. In the first episode, Nino and Yo-Yo, directed by Lombardi, the character Nino is a Neapolitan mamone. He is a portiere who's deceiving the residents of an upper-class condominium by pretending to work. He's protected by his sister Anna, who is also a nanny to Yo-Yo, a Chinese boy whose mother work prevents him from spending time with her. And Nino is reluctant at first to interact with Yo-Yo because of his preconceptions regarding immigrants. When his sister leaves for a trip, Nino delegates condominium duties to this young boy. However, later on, he also becomes accepting and empathetic of his friend Yo-Yo. It is interesting to notice how this story was inspired by interactions between Neapolitans and immigrants to provisions of babysitting services by Neapolitans themselves. In an article published in La Repubblica by Anna Laura De Rosa in 2012, it is reported that immigrants workers who are paid under the table for their long hours of work habitually seek babysitting from Neapolitans, babysitting services from Neapolitans who also are paid under the table. Frequently, when the immigrants have insufficient cash to pay a Neapolitan babysitter, these babysitters still provide food and clothing for these children. So humanitarian help. A second episode in Vieni a Vivere a Napoli is Luba by Frisco. The story deals with Luba, a Ukrainian television show star whose husband political corruption forced her to leave the country. In Naples, she becomes the caretaker of an elderly cantankerous man. The prejudices of this man and his family lead her to lose her job and wander the streets of Naples at night. After several adversities, her story attracts the media's attention and publicly results into improving her life. The story was inspired by the conditions in which many migrants, badanti, or caretakers are struggling with, especially because they cannot obtain a work visa. A tragic story revealing to this scenario is one of Natalia Beliova, badante, who recently died, saving the elderly couple that she was caring for from a fire. Third episode is Magnifico Shock by De Angelis. The story of neo-melodic singer Miriam, who's trapped by the exploitation of her manager. She's forced by her manager to perform at several closed scheduled events. Amila is a young Sinhalese recently hired at a coffee shop as a waiter. He's told by his supervisor to never leave without being paid. And so when the singer's manager does not pay him for his coffee delivery, he follows them to their car. And in the end, by the end of the day, Amila helps Miriam to comforting her, but also supporting her in a singing duet. Sinhalese are currently the second largest population of immigrants in Naples and have been integrating and interacting with native Neapolitans, working mostly in households and restaurants. Vieni a Vivere a Napoli is fundamentally an unconventional and good-willed comedy and seeming to alleviate some of the xenophobic conflicts between immigrants and Neapolitans. It is the tale of integration for three different migrating populations in Naples, a city of contradictions, always in flux. Naples has always been represented in its antitheses of attractiveness and jaggedness. Both immigrants and local experts expect the imminent resolution of these conflicts, except for when things get out of hand. Neapolitans and migrants both find strength to renew themselves in spite of the necessity of paying a price from both sides. The immigrants' attempt for integration in Naples seems to be in contrast to the vicissitudes of Neapolitans who are also trying to make a living for themselves. However, by reflecting on this so-called unusual comedy, we know that there is an intense reality for each of these three stories. Behind the tantrums of the melodic singer Miriam, her deflected career has been for the same as for neo-melodic Neapolitan singers in the last decades. And we also notice the Sinhalese Amila becomes Neapolitan singer rescuer in a way with his compassion. In Luba's stories, we observe by his family, mistreats immigrant, and Luba represents the stereotype of migrant women who have been trying to defend their basic rights to receive a visa in a union, by a union. The Neapolitan portiere Nino does not want to acknowledge the hardworking Chinese group of immigrants because he's fearful of losing his job, really. In this, we can infer that consciousness of our migrants can interact with Neapolitan population and help each other. The immigrants are a positive contribution to the local environment. A more recent docu-reality film, Rosa Pietrastella, by Marcello Sannino, is set in the outskirts of Naples. This film is based on a real person known by the director. It is the story of single mother Carmela struggles to find a stable occupation to support her daughter. Carmela's self-centered ambitions lead her to become involved in inducting immigrant clients to a crooked lawyer who sells for false visas. Soon enough, she realizes how unsupportive she has been to her daughter, especially when she's evicted from her house. She fights to keep her daughter, Maria, but out of despair, she decides to involve Tarek, an Algerian immigrant, in her false promises to obtain visas from his fellow countrymen. However, Tarek, who eventually helps Carmela, cannot be helped himself, and because the lawyer is absconded. Carmela represents the struggles of those citizens who live in the marginal society, and for this reason, lapse into practice and may become criminal. Director Sandino is well known for his previous work on documentaries such as Corte, La Seconda Natura, Porta Capuana. Rosa Pietra Stella is the first docu-reality that he created with some fictional elements. The director claimed explained in one of his recent interviews, quote, è una storia che tratta dei rapporti tra persone e personaggi e Napoli è più sullo sfondo. The film is an experimental in a way because it focuses on the humanity of characters more so than on the environment and Naples per se. It is about the intertwined relationships between characters. Particularly, Carmela is the first involved in black market jobs and with immigrants and finds herself in the same conditions of clandestinity as the illegal immigrant. So the film deals with social injustice and the humanization, especially for women who are too often discriminated against by society. Sandino also claimed that this approach to fiction is not dissimilar to documentaries. In fact, all cinematic production can be called fiction, since there is a decision taken before recording the scenes and how to connect the parts of the plot together. In this sense, the director is only trying a different approach to tell a story. In conclusion, the anthropological view which Marcello Sandino approaches docu-reality is interesting because it's not a fiction with a lieto fine or a happy ending, nor it is a documentary with a well-developed character. It does come with an ending that leaves space to our imaginary or continuing on. Both films, Rosa Pietra Stella, Viene a vivere a Napoli, aim to evaluate coexistence of humanity between different cultures and present integration of process, both immigrant and local, a struggle with the share and the peculiarity that unites them. These docu-realities do not offer immediate solutions. However, they present cultural transfer vehicles from one culture to another towards the process of integration. As books and literature may propose cultural transfer, also films and docu-realities can contribute as instruments of information analysis and criticism within this complex reality of migratory phenomena. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity to participate virtually in this conference in Italy. I'm going to provide a French perspective on the issue of cinema and the Mediterranean. Thank you very much. Thank you. First of all, I appreciate this opportunity to participate in your conference in Ortigia, Italy. It's quite exciting. I'm joining you from North Germany, so this is completely all around the world here. So my perspective is on France. I'm working on two films, one by Farid Bentoumi and another by Sofia Djama. So the conflicted relationship between Algeria and France has come dramatically to the fore in the first months of 2021. In preparation for next year, that's the 60th anniversary of the Evian Accords, which will commemorate the end of France's colonization of Algeria, President Emmanuel Macron made the decision to take on the challenges of commemoration associated with the, oh, are we still on? Well, I'm just going to continue. President Emmanuel Macron made the decision to take on the challenges of commemoration associated with the Algerian War of Independence, and that was between 1954 and 1962. Macron charged historian Benjamin Stora to draft a report with recommendations to help move both countries beyond their conflicted past. In January of this year, Stora, himself a Jewish Pied Noir born in Algeria, submitted his report with multiple proposals, among which was the suggestion that Macron form a memory and truth commission that could assemble historians, high-ranking officials, diplomats, CEOs, and artists from both shores of the Mediterranean. The goal is to find ways to achieve a reconciliation of memories. Thereupon, Macron appointed Benjamin Stora to lead the commission. This project of the reconciliation of memories is a complex one. Stora cautions his interviewers that historians should not attempt to create a definitive fixed version of past events, nor to expect the French and Algerian imaginaries to be identical. Instead, his objective is to work against what he calls the fragmentation of memories, affecting especially the young, who often only encounter repeated, biased accounts presented in their textbooks. And I did have a PowerPoint, but I will try to explain. Stora focuses, Stora focuses on countering the instrumentalization of the past by nationalistic lobbyists. For instance, in France, the repression of the knowledge that the French army used torture on nationals from Algeria as well as from France, or that amnesty was granted in 1968 to the far-right OAS generals who had mounted a putsch in 1961 against de Gaulle's government once he had begun negotiations for Algeria's independence. On the Algerian side, textbooks have promoted the one-sided idealization of Algeria's freedom fighters of the 50s and 60s, which has also served to justify the one-party rule of the FLN, that's the National Liberation Front, after independence. So in response to such instrumentalization, Stora affirms that history can and should serve as a firebreak, and his proposals provide strategies to facilitate more dialogue and collaboration between the two nations. He proposes, for instance, that both French and Algerian historians located on either side of the Western Mediterranean should be granted equal access to historical archives, and that 3 dates be added to the French national calendar of commemorations. What I find interesting as a cultural studies person is that Stora emphasizes the importance of cultural work to support the appeasing of memories. In a Zoom interview at Columbia University this past March, Stora noted that his proposals have actually found more acclaim among writers and film directors who also confront the complexity of history than among fellow historians who worry that Stora's intervention crosses the line between historiography and activism. Within the context of Francophone cinema studies, I argue that Stora is right to focus on the complex exchange and intersections of Franco-Algerian culture. And the two contemporary films that I propose to analyze illuminate that commitment. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Thank you. Otherwise, I'm really speaking into the void here. So the two films, and I just wanted to mention that both films were showcased. I don't know if you are familiar with the annual film festival called Ciné-Med, which takes place in Montpellier in France, and filmmakers from all around the Mediterranean basin are invited to participate, and it's been going on for at least 42 years. So both of the films that I'm talking about have been part of Ciné-Med, okay? So Good Luck Algeria and The Blessed explicitly thematize the tangled relationship between characters marked both by the French and Algerian cultures, although they do it in distinct ways. Bentoumi foregrounds characters who have immigrated from Algeria to France and there have raised bicultural children, now adult, whereas Djama focuses on protagonists based in Algiers, the capital city of Algeria. And they are grappling with the decision to emigrate. Farid Bentoumi, born and raised in France, thus confronts his Algerian heritage differently than Sofia Djama, born and raised in Algeria. Bentoumi self-identifies as a perfect little Savoyard from the Savoy Alps, born in France to an Algerian father and a French mother, and portrays the link between communities on both sides of the Mediterranean in an affirmative but also nostalgia-tinged way. Djama, on the other hand, chooses to limit the scenario of the Blessed to the south shore of the Mediterranean and depicts the process and impact of emigration to France with more ambivalence. The contrast of these two feature films provides a way to move beyond a French imaginary projected onto the southern shore of the Mediterranean by tracking everyday cultural images and social representations through the filter of film directors with their own differently split cultural affiliations. Now, the recent history that Bentoumi and Djama reference in their films is not directly the Algerian War of Independence that already lies 60 years behind us. Instead, the films are haunted by the Black Decade. It's the violent 1990s, which one can understand as an offshoot of Algeria's colonial past, in that it involved the struggle between the one-party rule of the FLN and the Islamist FIS party. And that FIS party actually won that first election. And then the FLN annulled the election results, which triggered the decade-long violence in the country. Benjamin Stora identifies this Black Decade as une guerre gigogne, that's a nested war, similar to the Russian dolls that hide smaller and smaller dolls within. And the quotation is, again, from Stora. I translated it. He says, hidden behind the religious and secular conflicts lies the struggle for power between men and clans. Hidden behind the struggle for power lies the clash of economic interests, not least of the large oil and gas corporations. Hidden behind the cruel and incomprehensible violence, there lies a tradition of violence pervasive in a society that was colonized over a long period of time, actually 132 years. Between 60,000 and 150,000 people died in the 1990s as a result of domestic terrorism. And the destructive chaos of this decade-long conflict, where international journalists were barred from entering the country, led Stora to designate it also as la guerre invisible, the invisible war. Bentoumi and Djama staged the effects of the Black Decade on their protagonists in a markedly different way. In his comedy, Bentoumi explores the impact of the return to Algeria after a decade-long hiatus of summer vacations there. The nostalgic opening shots of the protagonist Sam as a young boy playing with his cousins highlight his simultaneously inside and outsider status due to his inability to understand Arabic. Good Luck Algeria captures the true story of the film director's brother, Noureddine Bentoumi, who was able to qualify for the Olympics cross-country ski event in 2006 by representing Algeria as lone member of the national team. The comic effects in the 2015 feature film are particularly effective when Sam meets with the Algerian official who needs to sponsor him on behalf of the country for the Olympics. One of the criteria for representing Algeria is that Sam must have a passport, but the interview degenerates when it becomes clear that Sam, the new Algerian athlete, does not really speak Arabic, has last been in Algeria in 1988, has completed his military service in France, and has never voted. The official remarks in Arabic that Sam is only Algerian when it is convenient, with Sam only able to smile weakly in incomprehension. The comedy culminates, however, in a trans-regional mediascape when Sam, like the filmmaker's actual brother, qualifies to race in the Olympics. At the end of the film, the montage shifts from Sam competing on the cross-country track near Torino to the multi-generational Algerian relatives gathered at home in the village before a large screen TV, interspliced with the reaction of Sam's wife, his daughter, and his parents as spectators in the stadium, all cheering as he enters the sports arena bearing the Algerian flag. Now, in the opening scene of The Blessed, by contrast, viewers are confronted by code switching as the camera tracks the motion of a car and the passing concrete cityscape, while the radio broadcast updates the driver with the latest news in French. The messaging in the opening credits, as well as details from the news flashes, make it clear that the context of this film is Algeria, however, not France. The news announcer reports, for instance, on a university strike over President Bouteflika's move to stand for elections for a third mandate, and the spectators understand, in violation of the Constitution. At stake in this film is the assertion that l'Algérie n'a pas encore fait le deuil de ses morts. Algeria has not yet undergone the public mourning of its dead. The trauma of the civil war of the 1990s has not yet been worked through, not in 2008, the timeline of the plot that occurs 20 years after the nationwide protests for more democracy in Algeria, nor by 2017, when Djama's film was released. The Blessed, Les Bienheureux, thus constitutes one public method of confronting Algeria's traumatic past and its contemporary after effects. This ensemble film switches more and more quickly between two plot lines focused on two households, Samir and Amal's life with their 17-year-old son Fahim, and the situation of Fahim's young, not quite girlfriend, Feriel. Now, Feriel attempts to shoulder the familial responsibilities of her mother, who had committed suicide after having experienced unidentified atrocities during the 1990s civil war. In the other plot line, Fahim's mother, Amal, continually tells her husband that the life of the adults who experienced the civil war no longer matters. It is the next generation's future that must concern them. Her plan for her son Fahim is to build on his high school diploma from a French lycée in Alger in order to send him to a university in France. Samir, on the other hand, still believes in the viability of life in Alger for his family, including for Fahim. In this microcosm located in the capital city, the choices for the different characters keep getting blocked. Aside from physical constraints like unexpected power outages or multiple police checkpoints set up unpredictably on different streets, the adults like Samir and Amal find themselves without resources. Djama's film, in contrast to Bentoumi's Good Luck Algeria, thematizes gendered discrimination more systematically. Amal must contend with gender-specific constraints. So even Samir's repeated rejoinder, elle est majeure, she is an adult, does not resonate. The attempt to challenge social gendered practice on an individual level is met with increasing levels of sanction. Sofia Djama uses the cityscape effectively to contrast the situation of Samir and Amal. Whereas Samir steps out onto the balcony and takes in the evening lights of the city bathed in the call to prayer, Amal's view begins with a panorama of the city until the camera slowly withdraws to show the white grid through which she is gazing. The transformation of the shot emphasizes the distance between her and the city, as well as her sense of being closed in. By the end of the film, once Amal has decided that she must leave Algeria with Fahim, she steps to the wide window of her apartment one last time to take in the sweep of the city and the harbor before brusquely pulling down the blinds to make the decisive break. The double plot line that shifts between the two households intersects through the narrative strand focused on the next generation, Fahim's and Feriel's friendship, marked by frequent sparring bouts between them. Fahim's friendship with Reda, a self-avowed devout Muslim, is motivated in part by Fahim's desire to antagonize his parents, who belong to the 1988 activist generation. Significantly, the moral bankruptcy of Reda's religious fervor becomes apparent when Fahim ends up taking the rap for Reda, who had asked him to hold his bag with hashish shortly before police unexpectedly perform yet another random identity check on the street. As the police arrest Fahim, Reda chooses quickly to slip away. In a 2017 interview, Djama notes the return of Islamist bigotry in post-Civil War Algeria, and that this return was already perceptible by 2008. Through the young girl, Feriel's trajectory, on the other hand, the Blessed lays bare the intersection of two forms of violence leveled against women in post-1990s Algeria. Feriel's role in her nuclear family as sole daughter forces her into a caretaking role as her father seems unable to function, and her brother, like Fahim's friend Reda, channels the social message of patriarchy that as a young girl she's inferior, relegated to household chores and silence. The fact that the civil war of the 1990s has killed their mother and almost cost Feriel her life, leaving a broad scar across her throat, is met with her brother's indifference. For him, the scar is a marker of her ugliness that needs to be hidden, repressed, much like the memory of the Black Decade. Despite the trauma and everyday oppression that Feriel needs to navigate, she assumes an energetic spunkiness in the film. She balances her household duties with her university studies, and in the banter between the younger characters, it is Feriel who mockingly demystifies Reda's religious discourse. By the end of the film, Feriel's future remains ambiguous. The ending leaves unresolved which path Feriel will follow, in contrast to her friend Fahim, who will be studying in France. At stake in Sofia Djama's film is the question whether the new generation will be able to continue in some way the activism of their parents' generation of 1988, which has become disillusioned by the failure of their push for multi-party democracy, or whether this new generation is simply going in the same direction as the one before it. The comparison of Bentoumi's and Djama's films highlights a shared commitment to capture the interface of French and Algerian cultures, although the difference in their approach to the Black Decade is palpable. Despite its many comic scenarios, Bentoumi does touch upon the potential for violence, but his film ultimately skirts the threat. In response to Sam's decision to represent Algeria at the Olympics, his father Kader hopes mistakenly that the paternal olive tree orchards in Algeria will remain in the family, with Sam accepting to manage the business personally. Sam, for his part, is attempting to forestall the foreclosure of his co-owned ski business in the French Savoy Alps, as his funds continue to dwindle while he trains for the Olympics. When it becomes clear to the extended family in Algeria that Sam will not be taking over the father's role, nor is he really equipped to, a rather intense multi-generational altercation erupts. The unraveling of kinship over land rights seems inevitable, yep, got it, yet is averted, but only off camera, when, as Sam is still asleep, Kader transfers ownership of the property to his brothers and their families by negotiating a price, and thereby can provide his son the funds to carry on with his Olympics sales venture. Through Kader's decision to sell his land parcels to his brothers and their families, the family connection across the Mediterranean can ultimately be reinforced, and the resulting Algerian heritage can secure Sam and his family's prosperity in France. Bentoumi does call his comedy a feel-good film. Now, Sofia Djama's commemoration of the Black Decade is more overt in her attempt to render the nested civil war and its aftermath visible. Even if one set of protagonists opts to emigrate to France at the end of the film, Djama includes scenes that cast new Franco-Algerians on holiday in Alger as having deserted their fellow comrades of the 80s and the earlier democratic struggle. Even Samir, who clings to his life in Algeria, recognizes how his modest dream of establishing a medical clinic will fail despite his network of friends and connections, and that he will be left to his clandestine activism of performing illegal abortions out of an apartment. In short, the trajectories of Djama's protagonists highlight how the political and social constraints serve to block the energy and vision of characters like Feriel and Samir, or end up funneling those with cultural capital, like Amal and Fahim, out of the country. To provide one last wrinkle to the process of commemorative representation, the Blessed provides a contemporary representation of Alger. Arjun Appadurai might call it the historical present, and Djama's description of Algerian cinema shows how complicated such a project can actually be. In an interview held in March 2019, she explains, quote, "We can't talk about Algerian film having this big movement because if we talked about Algerian film today, we would be talking about 5 or 6 known filmmakers from the new generation because film festivals chose them for us. My film is an international co-production with a distributor. It's the international market that makes us see more of certain kinds of films with certain directors over others," end quote. The two films thus allow us, the viewers, a glimpse of the complex interdependence of French and Algerian identity through a common, though not identical, history. Farid Bentoumi's and Sofia Djama's films foreground the need for nuanced representations of the crossover of such trans-Mediterranean identities, including the recognition that purely South Shore or North Shore Mediterranean depictions are themselves inflected by an intercultural cinematic industry. Thank you.